There is something beneath the ice that history forgot to mention. Not a metaphor, not a legend passed down through generations of Arctic fishermen, distorted by time and retelling. A literal something, buried under permafrost, under sediment, under nearly 2 centuries of careful silence. In 1847, a British naval expedition stumbled upon what should have been one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries of the 19th century. What they found in that frozen darkness was not glory, not the Northwest Passage they had set out to claim. It was something far older, far stranger, and far more difficult to explain. 3,000 human skeletons, arranged beneath the ruins of a settlement no one had recorded, in a region where no civilization was supposed to have existed. The official record, sparse and oddly guarded, calls it a geological curiosity. A footnote, something to be filed away and, perhaps, deliberately forgotten. To understand what happened in the summer of 1847, you need to understand the world that sent those men into the ice. The British Admiralty had been obsessed with the Northwest Passage for decades, a theoretical sea route threading through the Arctic archipelago of northern Canada, connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific. It was the great imperial dream of the age. A shortcut to the east, a proof of British naval supremacy, a line drawn through the last blank space on the map. In May of 1845, Sir John Franklin had departed with 2 ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, carrying 129 men, 3 years of provisions, and the absolute confidence of a civilization that believed it could conquer anything, including the Arctic winter. By 1847, that confidence had curdled into dread. Franklin's expedition had gone silent. Rescue missions began to pour into the high north, one after another, each returning with nothing but frostbite and uncertainty. It was during one of these rescue expeditions, a smaller, less celebrated mission captained by a Lieutenant James Fairholme, operating separately from the main search parties, that the discovery was made. Fairholme's journal, held today in a subdirectory of the Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge, England, has never been fully published. Researchers who have accessed it describe it as fragmented and water-damaged, convenient, perhaps, or simply the honest fate of a document that survived an Arctic winter. Fairholme's party had been navigating the coastline of what is now the Boothia Peninsula in late July of 1847 when one of his junior officers, a man named Robert Ashe, noticed something unusual in the rock face above the shoreline. The ice had receded that summer. Unusually, dramatically receded. Locals who had traded with British expeditions for years described that particular season as unlike any they had witnessed in memory. The melt exposed something that had been locked beneath the surface for what geologists would later estimate to be, at minimum, several hundred years. What Ashe saw was not a cave. The official account describes it as a collapsed subterranean chamber, a man-made construction of stone and compacted earth, its roof long since caved in by the weight of centuries and ice. Inside, or rather within the exposed ruins of this structure, the bones began. Fairholme's journal records the count methodically, almost mechanically, in the way that a man writes when he does not know how to process what he is seeing. The first entry reads, "Counted 47 complete or near-complete skeletal remains in the western portion of the chamber. The surgeon, Mr. Goodsir's assistant, estimates all adult. All appear to have perished simultaneously or within a very short window of time." Subsequent entries over 3 days of excavation revised that number upward. 32, 47, 112, 209. By the time the team was forced to retreat due to weather, they had documented what Fairholme called no fewer than 3,000 individual human remains spread across what appeared to be a system of connected underground chambers extending back into the cliff face. 3,000 people. In a place where, according to every map, chart, and navigational record the British possessed, no city had ever stood. The formal report filed by Fairholme upon his return to London in the autumn of 1847 runs to 11 pages. A copy exists in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. It is a careful document, measured, precise, professionally written. And yet, if you read it slowly, something begins to feel wrong. The report devotes 4 pages to the meteorological conditions of the voyage. It devotes 2 pages to the state of the ship's provisions. It devotes exactly 1 paragraph to the discovery of the bones. 1 paragraph for 3,000 human skeletons found in the ruins of an unknown Arctic settlement. The British Admiralty's official record allocates roughly 150 words. The language is passive, almost bureaucratic. Skeletal remains were observed. A subterranean structure of unknown origin was identified. No artifacts of navigational or strategic significance were recovered. No artifacts of navigational or strategic significance. This phrase has troubled every researcher who has encountered it since. Because what it implies, quietly, almost inaudibly, is that artifacts were recovered. Just not ones the Admiralty considered worth reporting. What kind of artifacts found in a 3,000-year settlement do not qualify as significant? What was in those chambers that someone decided the public did not need to know? Dr. Alastair Morrison, a maritime historian at the University of Edinburgh, spent 4 years in the 1990s attempting to access the full Fairholme archive. He published a short paper in 1997 in the journal Arctic Exploration History, noting that several boxes listed in the catalogue of Fairholme's return materials from the 1847 voyage were marked as transferred to the Colonial Office, an institution whose successor departments have confirmed no record of ever receiving them. For boxes, transferred, gone. Here is what we do know, drawn from the fragments that remain. The settlement, based on the architectural style of the exposed stonework, bore no resemblance to any known Inuit construction technique of the period. The chambers were rectilinear, right-angled, deliberately proportioned. Several of the stones showed what Fairholme's surgeon described as markings of an indeterminate character, neither alphabetic nor pictographic by any system known to me. In 1978, a Canadian archaeological team working in the same general region of the Boothia Peninsula, not aware, apparently, of Fairholme's report, uncovered a series of stone foundations consistent with what the 1847 journal described. Carbon dating placed the structures at between 800 and 1200 CE. Pre-contact, pre-Viking, a settlement that had been occupied, grown, and collapsed entirely outside the known narrative of Arctic human history. When the Canadian team published their findings, a footnote in their report referenced a possible earlier British survey of the site, details unavailable. No citation. No follow-up. A footnote and then silence. The question that no one has been able to answer satisfactorily is this: who were they? 3,000 people represents a significant population. Not a seasonal hunting camp, not a small band of nomadic families seeking shelter. 3,000 people is a city. A city requires agriculture or highly organized trade or both. A city at that latitude, in that period, rewrites what we believe we know about human movement through the Arctic during the medieval period. It suggests networks of knowledge, of migration, of civilization that our current models simply do not account for. Some researchers have proposed a connection to the Dorset culture, the pre-Inuit people who inhabited much of Arctic Canada before disappearing mysteriously around 1000 CE. The timing roughly aligns. The Dorset were sophisticated, more so than their archaeological footprint suggests. They built, they carved, they maintained communities across vast distances of ice. But even within optimistic Dorset population estimates, a settlement of 3,000 would have been extraordinary. The largest known Dorset sites housed, at most, a few hundred people. Others have proposed something more unsettling: that this was not a single indigenous population at all, but a convergence, a gathering, that the 3,000 had come from somewhere or multiple somewheres, and that whatever brought them together also ended them. In the reading room of the Scott Polar Research Institute, There is a collection of personal correspondence donated in 1923 by the family of Robert Ashe, the junior officer who first noticed the exposed ruins in 1847. The letters were donated quietly, with no accompanying press notice, and they sat uncatalogued for nearly 40 years. Among them is a letter dated September 14, 1848, written by Ashe to his brother in Bristol. He had, by this point, left the Royal Navy. The letter is mostly mundane, news of his health, inquiries about family, but near the end, there is a paragraph that seems to have been added hastily, in a slightly different ink, as though composed separately and inserted afterward. It reads, in part, "I have not spoken of what we saw in the north to anyone whose discretion I cannot vouch for, and I advise you to the same caution. What troubled me most was not the bones themselves, but their arrangement. They were not scattered as one finds in a mass death. They were placed. Whatever these people were, someone had arranged them, or they had arranged themselves. I have not determined which possibility is more disturbing to me. Arranged." Ashe's letter sat in that archive for 4 decades before anyone read it. When a researcher named Patricia Calloway encountered it in 1961, she noted it in a private correspondence to a colleague at Oxford as potentially significant. That colleague replied that it was almost certainly an embellishment, the natural tendency of memory to dramatize. Calloway apparently agreed, or at least said nothing further. Her research notes, filed with her papers at Edinburgh, contain a single additional reference to the Ashe letter. A question mark written in pencil with no accompanying text. Just a question mark. There is also the matter of the ship's surgeon. Fairholme's medical officer, a man named George Trent, published a memoir in 1854 that touched briefly on his Arctic service. The memoir is out of print and exists in perhaps a dozen copies across British university libraries. In the relevant passage, Trent writes that the bones showed no evidence of violence, nor of starvation, nor of any disease process recognizable to modern medicine. He adds, and this sentence is the one that researchers keep returning to, "They appeared, to all signs available to my examination, simply to have stopped. Simply to have stopped. 3,000 people in an underground city who simply stopped. No war. No plague. No famine. No visible cause. An entire civilization that one day ceased to be, and arranged itself, or was arranged, in the dark beneath the ice." The official position of the British Admiralty, insofar as it ever had one, was that the remains were of indigenous origin, and were not within the purview of naval inquiry. A letter from the Hydrographic Office dated February 1848, responding to an inquiry from a Royal Geographical Society member who had somehow heard of the discovery, states plainly that no findings of archaeological significance were documented during the rescue missions of 1847. No findings. Yet the Fairholme report exists. The Ashe letters exist. Trent's memoir exists. The Canadian archaeological site exists, dated and documented, with foundations that match. The 4 missing boxes of transferred materials exist in a catalog, even if they no longer exist in any archive. Something happened on the Boothia Peninsula, at some point between 800 and 1200 CE, to 3,000 people who had built something remarkable in the ice. And something happened in the autumn of 1847, when the men who found them came home and, on the whole, chose or were directed not to speak of it. The question of why is, in some ways, easier to speculate about than the question of who. The 19th century British establishment had very particular ideas about the geography of civilization. The notion that a sophisticated, populous settlement had existed in the high Arctic, predating European contact, operating outside any known historical framework, was not merely inconvenient. It was, in a very real sense, structurally incompatible with the colonial self-image of an empire that styled itself as the bringer of civilization to the world's dark places. What do you do as an imperial power when you discover that the darkness was already lit? You file a 1-paragraph report. You transfer 4 boxes. You mark the catalog and you move on. Perhaps the explanation is simpler than all of this. Perhaps the bones were exactly what the official record implies. An unremarkable find, misremembered and mythologized over time. Perhaps Ash's letter was an embellishment. Perhaps Trent's memoir was colored by the romanticism of age. Perhaps the missing boxes contained nothing more than geological samples and navigational charts, transferred for perfectly mundane bureaucratic reasons and lost in the ordinary entropy of institutional record-keeping. Perhaps. But the bones were there. 3,000 of them, in a city no map had ever named, built by people no history had ever recorded, who died or were left, in a silence so complete that it took the retreat of an unusually warm summer's ice to break it. And for one brief window, in the late summer of 1847, a small group of British naval officers stood in that silence and looked at what the world had forgotten. And then they went home. And they were very, very quiet. The ice has since returned. The permafrost has settled. The Boothia Peninsula keeps its own counsel, as it has for centuries, and the questions that Robert Ashe could not answer still wait somewhere beneath it. Maybe they are waiting for a warmer summer. Maybe they are waiting for someone willing to ask them in the right way. Or maybe the people of that city, in whatever wisdom or desperation drove them underground, understood something about the nature of being remembered that we have not yet managed to learn. We know where they are. We simply do not know who they were. And perhaps, after nearly 2 centuries of careful forgetting, that is precisely how someone wanted it.